G'day, and welcome back to the Farms Advice podcast. We had a brief few weeks away from the microphone, which has done me well. I've got plenty of ideas coming up around the corner for how we can grow out the scope for you, grow farm podcasting, and see how we can truly have some impact. And on today's episode, Carmen Quade's ready to have some impact of her own as well. Agri-focused, she loves to get into the farm office, get it running, and to make everything a little bit sexier, talking about bank reconciliations, to your cash flow, your budgeting. How can it help you on the farm, get you out in the paddock a bit more? If your farm office is running quite well, you've got it set up amazingly, you're going to be more likely to actually get it done, enjoy what you're doing, and actually have some success behind that as well. So I thought it was a cool episode to put out, and I hope that you get some real benefit as well. Let us know at Farms Advice socials what you thought of the episode, what you'd like content-wise, and even if you'd like Carmen to come on again and speak about another topic, we can make that happen. So thanks for having me back on the Farms Advice podcast. Let's get stuck into this episode. Carmen, welcome to the Farms Advice podcast. Great to have you in here. And for anyone listening in, you probably need a pen and a piece of paper to get a hold of this episode as well. So, Carmen, welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me.
It's been great. And, of course, another person, we've been in the same sort of sphere, haven't we, online, and looking at what you do, and you've probably seen a bit of Farms Advice, but Twitter usually is a good home for Australian agriculture, and that's where we connected over a simple tweet. So thank you for showing your support to the podcast. Probably our values as well align quite similar to yours.
Definitely, Jack. And we're sort of really not all that far up the Newell or down the Newell from you, being just out of West Wyalong. So geographically, compared to some of your audience, we're probably quite close together.
The east or west of the Newell? That was.
We're west.
Good stuff. Yeah. We're only just west, but beautiful. So, Carmen, introduce yourself, your background into Australian agriculture, and how did you land up into the role that you're doing today?
So, it's a long story. How long you got? So, I grew up in Sydney, but I now run a business called Agri-focused. I'm based on our farm out at Talimba, so west of West Wyalong. Agri-focused is a business which focuses on training for family farmers in the area of business skills, admin, finance, all of that sort of thing. So basically the CFO or CEO and office end of the farming business.
And is it just yourself working at Agri-focus?
Yes, it's just me. Yep. So I do outsource a little bit of stuff and occasionally bring in somebody else to help, but definitely predominantly me. So I started off in the university field, so lecturing undergraduate ag students and accounting students, and I really loved that work, but certainly saw a gap in providing similar sorts of skills and information and knowledge to people working in their own farming businesses, so that we're actually out on the ground doing these sorts of things. So I started this about 5 years ago, and it's been really great, certainly great opportunities to teach other people, and certainly great opportunities to learn a lot that I've brought back into our own farming business.
So probably establishing the gap, what was that gap that you saw within Australian farming, within your region?
Oh, look, I think the gap is Australia-wide, possibly even worldwide. People go into farming because they love the production side of things. They really love that outside side, if it's cropping or livestock, the dirt, the growing of things. And if people wanted to get into a business or wanted to get into something that was more administrative or more financial, they tend to go in different directions. So they're coming into agriculture with a certain level of knowledge, a preference for a certain aspect of the business. And then there's the gap then when you start to get to that stage within your farming business or within your family succession process where you're responsible for those financial decisions, that the administrative tasks, all of that sort of stuff, that you just realise, well, there's perhaps something that you need to know more. And certainly difficult situations or difficult seasons and family transition and pressures to expand do put the pressure on individuals to sort of step up in those roles. That if you're running a steady state business with a fairly high level of equity, you're in a region with consistent seasons, you're not looking at any intergenerational stuff, it can be business as usual. And you can sort of, focus every year on doing what you're doing, and most years it will work, and you don't have perhaps that much need for these sorts of things. And then suddenly you hit a couple of bad years, you go into succession, or you might be only one of these things, or you decide you want to expand, and suddenly you just realise that there's some stuff out there that you don't really know a lot about. And that's where we come in.
Is it complacency with farmers, sort of just like for their production, turning over the same sort of production each year, which may be a great outcome for them, but about that expansion as well, or looking for the different opportunities? Is that how it sort of comes in as well?
Well, look, I think it's different things. So if you look at the business life cycle, most businesses start off smaller and lower levels of profitability and a real need for capital investment. And then they go through periods of growth and expansion, and then they reach a steady state. Now, some people might just like to maintain that steady state for a really long period. Other people might have different external pressures on expansion or internal pressures, so that, they have a real drive to do something. And I don't think anyone with their philosophy is wrong. As long as you're living true to your values, as long as you've got your eye on your long-term goals, it's okay just to sort of continue gently rowing the boat. But if that's not where you're at, that's not where the people around you are at, and that's not going to serve your goals in the long term, it's great fun to actually just really get in there and really invest a lot of your time and yourself in your business, expand your skills, and then, go for broke. But you see it in family businesses. So, you have a younger generation that come on with a bit of a push, and often that sort of lifts the older generation as well. They sort of get reinvigorated and reinvested, and there's a lot of capital expansion going on, capital investment, and that's fantastic. And then things do tend to taper off a little bit in most businesses, and that's not unique to agriculture. We can often look around our local towns and see, the whole under new management thing. People come in, they invest, they do some great stuff, and you're just so happy. And then, 5, 10, 15 years down the track, you can get a little bit stale.
I think for succession, like the farming community probably just thinks succession is within farming only, but every business needs a successor, whether it's a new entrant or the family carrying it on, depending if they're corporate or a family business.
Yeah, definitely. And in the corporate world, if you're in the corporate world, you do hear a lot about succession planning in terms of that senior management level, and making sure that corporate knowledge isn't lost generation on generation, or from, senior manager to senior manager. So definitely.
I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the corporate world and bring it across. And that was probably my experience going to London and bring something back to ag. And that's probably the podcast, trying to communicate a bit better anyway. So let's talk about, you mentioned goals before. What's your New Year's resolutions for yourself, and what do you think the goals are of your current clients?
Oh, look, I think that, there's probably a lot different. My goal this year is to watch more television, because I've sort of got into this pattern of probably taking a little bit too much on and not having enough for that real downtime, leisure time. And I think there's still a place for just sitting out and chilling in front of the telly. So I've decided to make a bit more time for that this year. In terms of clients' goals, I think it's been an interesting pattern of seasons. I think wherever you are around Australia, there's been a lot more market volatility in the livestock game that we haven't seen for a really long time. We've got so much going on with interest rates and access to capital that it's just... And I was talking to this with someone I was just grabbing a coffee with this morning. You can't approach each year thinking it's business as usual, or you can't predict with any great certainty what the season's going to bring. So we're predominantly cropping. we could have a bin buster of a year, or we could be just scratching to get seed back, and we could have anything in between that. Certainly, the further west you are in cropping regions, maybe further east, not so much of a consideration, but it's that whole thing about being ready for anything. I think if the last decade's taught me something. So ready to take those opportunities when they come up, and ready to make the most of good seasons, and ready with the sort of strategies in mind to handle it if it doesn't go your way.
I find it super interesting trying to pick the markets with the weather and everything, and how your strategy sort of plays off that. But also on the other side, super frustrating. If you can't get the crop in, or you can't get a crop off, or the lambs aren't doing as well, or something like that, fruit trees aren't growing or producing. It's a great thing, but also it's pretty daunting as well, not knowing if you're going to get a crop for this.
Yeah, and then I think perhaps our efforts need to be less on predicting. And I think there's some great tools out there that might be able to help us in a seasonal sense to do that, but often they're a little bit unreliable. But it's more about saying we could be facing any one of these 3 or 4 scenarios. What's our action plan for each one of them? And that gives you a huge sense of confidence in saying, oh, well, look, okay, I know what the button is to press if we get the dry season. I know what the button is to press if the livestock prices go gangbusters. And knowing that and thinking through those scenarios, I think is probably more empowering than trying to say, I reckon wheat's going to get to 450 this year. Because that essentially, for most of us who aren't in that, we're not predicting wheat prices as our main job. We're not trying to do that 40, 50 hours a week. It's only ever going to be a short part of our time. We can't really do that as farming businesses to the level that someone that's in it all the time. So let's concentrate on our core business, which is growing. And let's look at those strategies to actually manage those times as they come.
Is it as black and white as having a great, good and bad scenario for your accounting?
Well, I think it's about being a little bit realistic about it too. So you might, if you go great, good and bad, so just say in a cropping sense, we're very unlikely to have maximum cropping costs in a low yield year. Now, all of the people around the sort of Central West or up and down the Nile that got flooded out a few years ago would be going, no, Carmen, that's not true. But generally speaking, we don't get max production costs in cropping and a minimal yield year. So you just have to say that your your good, bad, worst scenario might look like less variable costs but less income. But your best case scenario is never going to look like a cheap year and really high yields or high production. And that varies a little bit depending on what sort of livestock or horticultural enterprise you run, but what the scenarios or the realistic scenarios are for you. So it's not just about saying, okay, a good year looks like 30% more income and a bad year looks like 30% less income. It's about having a really good handle on what's consistent, so what your overhead expenses are, and the relationship between your variable cost, your production, and your price. So there's those 3 variables in income, and I think that's why forecasting is difficult, because there's 3 variables there. So we're looking at our production may vary, our variable costs might change, and our price might also change.
Absolutely. There's so many different elements to it, isn't there? Everything's variable. So for this episode, we discussed prior about what we should be talking about. There's a lot of sort of topics that we could go down, but I wanted to unlock the power of the family farm office and how that goes, and go down the sort of budgeting, forecasting realm of it. How are family farms unlocking the power of the office, like besides using Carmen Quade, AgriFocus? How are they getting the most out of their books?
Look, I think it looks like knowing your numbers. So it might not look for every business like handling the labour side, like handling that sort of day-to-day transactional aspect of paying every bill themselves. They might have bookkeepers that help with that. They might engage an accountant to do that. They might just have one of the 4 or 5 lead people in the farming business concentrating on that aspect of it. But it's about everyone at that management or owner level knowing what the numbers are and what they mean. And I think that's where the real power comes. So we can look at outsourcing, streamlining, and I do a lot of that sort of work with people, but where the real power comes from is actually knowing what your numbers are and what they mean, and what a change in circumstance might mean for you.
Is there a few ratios that you make sure that family farms are looking at constantly to see what whereabouts they are within the season, within the year, and if they're ready to react or something to an opportunity as well?
Yeah, there's lots of great financial ratios that help you there. Lots of them come from the corporate world or from a business model where things are fairly consistent month on month. So some of them don't translate to regular review on a ratio basis month on month. So you might be looking at those big numbers like equity once per year after your major, after a ram sale or after most of your livestock are sold or after shearing or after harvest. So you might be looking at some of those big ratios, big picture ratios that time of year, but you're not looking at them consistently through the year because they're meaningless, because you would have invested a lot of money into your production costs. So that's certainly a consideration for some of them. Knowing how much cash you've got available, I think you need to know that all the time. What's coming in, what's going out, and how much cash is available. And I think businesses can make errors in two ways. They can make errors thinking that they've got more cash than they do, and they make decisions driven by that. Or they can make decisions based on thinking that they've got less cash than they've got. So that, there's a surplus there that they could execute, they could do something with, but they're a little bit afraid of spending it because they think they're going to need it for something. So being up to date with where you're at from a cash position is really, really powerful, because that just means being able to press the button on an opportunity.
This is probably really good information for new entrants, for those looking to get on farm as well, just to demonstrate what they need to be showing, what they're capable of as well. But let's get into budgeting, forecasting. I asked why are they important, but probably need to ask, are they important? The two, and can you just sort of differentiate the two?
Oh, well, look, they are important, because as much as we might be farming because we love it, love's not going to get you through. You've got to be making money. You have to be making money. And I had a chat to a fellow a while back, and he was saying, I love farming, but I don't love it enough to do it for free. And I think that's also important. So having that good handle on your cost of production as a starting point is so good. So yeah, it is crucial. You're running a farming business. It has to be able to pay the bills. It has to give you a living that you're comfortable with. If you've got your eye on intergenerational succession or a comfortable retirement or whatever the future looks for you in 20, 30, 40 years' time, you've got to have an eye on the prize in that respect as well. So I don't think anyone can really afford to ignore those numbers, really.
So looking at budgeting for the family farm, firstly, what kind of budgets are there?
So there's probably three main budgets. We've got our cash flow budgets, which we were touching on earlier. So just being aware of what's coming out and what's going in on a monthly basis, I'd suggest through the year, or forecasting it on a monthly basis through the year and checking in on that periodically. There's our project budgets, and they're really crucial. And that's an area that tends to be often overlooked and can result in some severe cash pressure in the short term on businesses. So, you decide to start a new silo complex, new set of yards, whatever it is, and setting out what that's actually going to cost, and not just the smaller components of it, but what else you might be looking to do opportunistically whilst you have, a concrete truck there or a dozer there or whatever else. So looking at that, and looking at that on a long-term basis, so you can actually say, okay, well, this project fits into this long-term goal, which means it needs to look at that, possible expansion that's going to happen in a decade's time. So those are really crucial. And then we have our bigger picture sort of strategy budget. So that might be forecasting what might happen if we decide to emphasize one enterprise over another, grow one particular enterprise, take on some leased country, buy a new farm, modelling what the impact would be if we decide to downsize, consolidate, drop a bit of debt out. So they're the bigger picture budgets.
How do you sort of write out a strategy budget?
Well, I think it's really about working out what you want to do. So what is it? I think a lot of people like to start with the concept stage. So my idea is I want to take on more land. And then you might just do some initial rough budgets. So just initial, they might even be back of the envelope sort of thing, saying, okay, well, look, this is my cost of production. This is how much it's going to increase our productive capacity. Does it meet that first test of looking like a vaguely profitable enterprise? And if it does, well, then that's when you get down, into that more depth of saying, okay, well, this is what it's going to look like in the initial stage of establishment. This is going to look at this. This is what it's going to look like when we get to that sort of steady state type stage of that business expansion, and working out whether those numbers are going to work for you. But then other people might look at it from a different perspective. So they might not have in mind what the long term is going to look like. So they haven't necessarily said, okay, this is what we want to do. It might be looking at the business as it is, forecasting that over a 5 to 10 year period and saying, okay, does that measure up with where we want to be? If it doesn't measure up with where we want to be, what are the 6 or 7 different opportunities we could pursue to get to that point? And then perhaps starting by running rough numbers on a couple of those little opportunities. So it just depends on which side you're coming from and how much time you've got. Because often people will just get a phone call saying, oh, this property's for sale. And you're going, oh, well, realistically, I have to do some numbers on it, even if it wasn't the strategy or wasn't something I had thought of before.
The timing of it's interesting because, obviously we are pretty time poor. It's probably where your priority lies, right? If you're trying to expand, you probably want to run your numbers before putting down 10 million, 3 million or 500 grand into new area, new machinery or something.
Definitely. And it's about what can be outsourced and what can't. So yes, labour can be hard to find, but the reality is that you can't get someone to think for you, whereas you can often get someone to do for you. So whatever sphere of your life it is, whether it's on farm, whether it's domestic, whether it's something else, shifting some of that time burden, shifting some of the mental load on the menial tasks that frees your brain up and your time up to do something that's sort of really focused more on those discussions about where you're heading and what you're heading. And look, you're right, Jack. I think getting your numbers right, if you think, look, at some stage I'm sitting here and some stage I think expansion would be on the cards, doing the big numbers on it to start with, so that when you get to the point of saying, okay, someone's giving you a phone call or an agent's rung or a neighbour's rung or you've seen something in the paper and it looks like a good opportunity, it's only about tweaking the budget you've already written rather than starting from scratch. And that's where the power of spreadsheets come in, because you can change the number of hectares, you can change the location, you can change the level of capital investment with just a few little clicks, and all of a sudden you've done the numbers on a new scenario.
You're pretty much everything. You're not reinventing the wheel within your own farm. It's sort of been done before, and especially like last year I had a theme of templates and processes, and the template being the Excel sheet as well can just be sort of tweaked and manipulated into your current scenario. I think that's pretty important, a good time saver on farm as well.
Definitely. And I think they're a really great pattern, like a really great way to measure your business growth and your skills growth. So you look at the spreadsheets you did 10 years ago, if you've saved them separately rather than kept on saving over the top of them, and you go, oh, look, that was actually a really simplistic view of what I was getting myself into. Now I've got a far more nuanced approach about what my cost of production is, or what my business looks like, or what, the costs might be of travelling to another block that's 50, 60, 70 Ks away. So, that is a bit of a journey that you've got to go on as a business owner to say, well, look, now I know more than I did a decade ago.
That's good. I like that. How do we actually improve our budgets? Maybe timeframes, reviewing, looking into this top-down, bottom-up sort of approaches.
Yeah. Look, I think the big thing that most people can do to improve is not get fixated on the small details. And that's the big error that I see people making, is like going down to saying, oh, well, that particular subscription for that software program cost me $25 a month. So they add that in as a line item. And then they add the next thing in as a line item. And you're just going, what you want to do is just throw big numbers at it. Like, no one that's farming should be like budgeting things to the 100. Yes, maybe some months or some particular point in time you're going, holy shit, there's not enough money there to pay for things. But look, and that's okay, but throw big numbers in your budget on things and focus on the profit drivers in your business. So rather than saying, oh, look, and you see people's budgets and they've got a line item for wool packs. Like, who cares? Like, a wool pack does not make you or break you. It goes up as your production goes up. It goes down as your production goes down. But it is not a driver of profitability, and it is not responsible for costs. So it's about bulking those sorts of things in your account categories with the make sure you discuss with your accountant, but bulking those little minor things in together, so it frees you up to concentrate on the big picture numbers that drive profitability in your business.
There'd definitely be some culprits out there that put in their wool packs for sure.
Oh, look, a lot of it's you inherit a chart of accounts. And you'll see some that have got light and power in them. You see some that have got things that perhaps were meaningful in a business model, in a business time where it was all about running things as cheaply as possible. But I think we now know that does not drive profitability or productivity. And it's all about saying, okay, my biggest resource that I have here is my land. That's where all of my money is invested. How do I make the most of that investment? And it's not running at 60% capacity. It's trying to run that sustainably and responsibly, but it's trying to run that at its capacity.
I'd love to know, like, not a survey that would do this, but just to see what farm capacity is, to see what they're running at, to like improve what we're doing as well. And probably a huge shock to the farmers across the country, but also like benchmarking as well, that sort of stuff. I can't see that survey ever happening, but as an independent farmers, it'd be cool to know.
I think benchmarking's got a huge amount of value. I think it's great, but realistically, the farm that you should be benchmarking yourself against is your own farming business. Because it's the only one that's exactly the same as yours. So yes, by all means, work with a benchmarking group, work with people in your industry, in your location, work with people out of your industry and out of your location. There's huge growth that comes from that. But you will gain a lot from comparing last year's numbers, the year before number, whatever, to where you're currently at. You'll gain more from that, gain a lot from that process.
Do you tend to look at like a 5-year span just to get a really good average, past all the sort of weather anomalies?
No, I like 10. I like 10 years. Because I think certainly in our region, if you say 10 years, you can count on pretty much having 2 bad years, 2 good years, and about 6 average years. So you can't really predict with any degree of certainty when those years will fall, and that I think does, skew that sort of 3-year time frame for planning a lot. But you could say, okay, look, over 10 years, realistically, what should we be able to achieve? And the other thing about a 10-year time frame is it's easy to add up. So it's easy to say, I'm 30 today, in 10 years' time I'll be 40. Or my youngest child is 6, in 10 years' time they'll be 16. And look at those sorts of family and lifestyle factors, how old your parents are, and those sorts of things, and say, okay, well, realistically, what do we want this business to look like in 10 years? What are we going to look like in 10 years? And yes, we're going to have a couple of those bad years in amongst the 10, but we can account for that in our longer term planning.
Yeah, nice. And back to the frustrating part of the farming game is weather and accounting for mishaps or when things don't go to plan, weather dependent. How do you sort of work with the books this way? Like if a drought comes in and we're not expecting it, La Nina's still here, but it's coming in, it dries off really quickly. How do we account for this sort of stuff, and what's the best sort of things to do?
Well, look, it depends on your enterprise. So if you're looking at livestock enterprise, the biggest short-term impact of a dry year is fodder. So it's about having a really good handle on at what point you'll have to buy in or use stored fodder and what's that going to cost you. So if it's bought in, looking at what's going to cost you if you're using stored fodder, what's the opportunity cost of that stored fodder. So having a good idea of the impact of a dry year on that fodder picture, and then having a bit of a think about livestock markets and what they're going to look like. We went through all these lovely drought years with high livestock prices, and they were a real treat. And I think those farm businesses that have come through those last 12 months that have had both dry years and low livestock prices, it's really been difficult. But there was certainly a time, in the Riverina where, yes, we had dry years, but the livestock prices held up, and that in itself sort of, cushioned, I think, a lot of us from harder decisions that would have had to have been made. So then if you've got cropping systems and you've got like dryland cropping systems rather than irrigated, but dryland cropping systems, how that's going to impact on your production costs, and likelihood is that they're going to come down, but you're going to have that lower income. It's not going to hit for quite some time. So it's about trying to get a little bit of an estimate of what your yields might be, or what the best in the situation that you're facing at that particular time, what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, and working out how you're going to make the numbers fit in that sense.
Do you find with clients that they don't do the costings for their own produced fodder, their grains or their silage or something like that, rather than when they buy it in, they're doing the costings pretty well there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one too. And there's other biosecurity reasons or cost of transport reasons why producing fodder on farm is quite beneficial. So that whole concept of opportunity cost, for those people that haven't heard of it, it's about saying, well, what do I give away from doing this? So basically, in a really simplistic thing, it's saying if you've got a ton of grain, you could sell, even though that ton of grain might have cost you $80, $90, $100 a tonne to produce, just say $100 a tonne to produce, you could be selling it for $400 a tonne in drought times, drought feed barley. So how do you cost that grain? Are you saying to yourself, well, that grain has only cost me $100 a tonne? Well, yes, but the opportunity cost of feeding that grain is $400, because you would know within 2 phone calls you could have a truck turned up and that grain could be out of the place at $400 a tonne. The opportunity cost of selling valuable bloodstock versus keeping valuable bloodstock, that's another sort of argument. So I think always looking at things from a couple of different perspectives, both the cash element of it, what the costs were, so the internal management production costs, but also looking at that opportunity cost side. The biggest factor, I think, that people ignore in terms of opportunity cost is the opportunity cost of their own labour, and failing to factor in the cost of their own labour. So that's when you're saying, okay, well, that hay only cost me X dollars a tonne to produce, but the reality is that your time went into that, and that is valuable, and your machinery went into that. And even though you might have haymaking gear that sits in the shed for 2 years out of 3, there's an opportunity cost in leaving that stuff in the shed as well. So it's just about, yes, finding the right fit for your business. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but it's about being honest with yourself about what those costs really are in terms of your cost of production.
How do you value yourself as a farmer? I like that question, but probably everyone's unsure of what they're worth per hour as a labour unit as well. Is it like a fixed rate of $100, or should we be on the minimum wage? How do you do that?
I think it's what you're doing, Jack, isn't it? So you're saying, okay, well, look, I'm sitting on a tractor and I could essentially get someone to do this job for me for, say, $35 an hour. So that work is worth $35 an hour. If you're making those really big picture decisions for your business, that's thousands of dollars an hour type work. So I don't think there's a one size fits all hourly rate, but you wouldn't want to be making any less than the hourly rate, than a standard hourly rate. Because I say to people, like, you're doing this and you're getting paid essentially $15 an hour, but you could go down to the bolo and you could be pulling beers for $35 an hour or $40 an hour on a Saturday night. So you've got to just make sure that the reality is that you're actually doing it for a rate that reflects the time that you've invested in it, because all you're doing is essentially selling hours of your life, and you're selling them for a very low rate. And as much as people love farming, we all love farming, there's other things that you possibly love more that are not getting done, or you're not doing because you're selling yourself to your own business at $15 an hour.
Absolutely. And probably from the last half an hour in this, we could charge out $4,000 and people are earning off that as well. It's probably our opportunity cost as well. But it's good stuff. What's coming out, Carmen? I love this, and we'll have to catch up for sure to dive into more sort of topics and everything further down the track. Looking at the budget reviews, you said 10 years you like to keep them sort of all together so that you can get that sort of trend line happening. What other sort of time frame should we be looking at to review? Quarterly?
So I think your long-term planning, you might not be doing budgets for 10 years in any great detail, but your long-term planning, your goals, etc., that's over a 10-year basis. Bank manager told me, I was talking to her about how long I needed to run an annual budget out, and she said, just keep going until it looks like you're making money, Carmen. And that has become my mantra. So you do realistically have to run a budget out. Look, we're in cropping. It's 12 months turnaround. We're not trying to, even in cattle systems, it's a much longer turnaround. You look at horticulture, much longer. So that's going to depend on your production system and everything else. So yeah, your strategy budgets, whatever else, that's got to match your enterprise and your goals and whatever. If we're looking at cash flow budgeting, a lot of people get upset with themselves because they think they should be doing it on a monthly basis and they never quite get around to it. Monthly review of businesses who have annual production cycles doesn't make a lot of sense. What happens is you sit down and you do your budget review and you're going, oh, well, we decided to hold on to those steers for an extra week and a half, so now they've fallen into the next month. And it's not that we're $50,000 behind. It's just we made a really practical, profitable decision to hold on to them for a little bit longer until they got up to the weight we wanted to have them at. So the monthly budget review just becomes a chore of shifting things from month to month. It makes a lot more sense to do a quarterly budget review just to make sure that things, then are on track. And then have a think about your production cycle and where the big expense and income lines change. So you might say, okay, look, after weaning, we've got a really good idea of where we're at in terms of our numbers. That's a really good time to look at our budget because we've got a much better handle on one of the three factors that affect our income: price, production, the price, production, and the variable costs. We know at that point what our production is going to be. So we've got a better idea of what's going on. So having a think about what those times are. So in a cropping enterprise, you're not looking at it quarterly. You really want to be looking at it after sowing because that's a bulk of your costs then done. You might want to be looking at just before summer, just at the end of that summer spraying period. And then again, just before harvest and of course after harvest. So that might not match up with a financial quarter, but you're still looking at it those times of year which are significant for your business.
It's very seasonally, isn't it? And going in with like spring, autumn, summer and winter. And also our activity, you don't want to do it before spraying, before weaning the lambs off to know what your production is. No.
And if you're running a stud, what's the use of doing it sort of just before you sale? You just wait until after. You don't want to be putting things off indefinitely. You don't want to be putting things off until a rainy day. Be a little bit disciplined about it, but just work out when those dates are, those trigger dates are in your business.
Looking at that, like if you have a sale or you're selling all of your grain in one sort of bulk load, how do you sort of split that out to sort of maximize or minimize the tax that you're paying on that, or just sort of spreading it out for your cash flow? Is there some sort of strategy that comes in within that?
Look, what you need to be doing as a farm business owner is running your business to maximize profitability.
Yeah.
And then you get a good accountant and you give the job of managing tax to them. Tax is not a problem. If your business is paying tax year in, year out, and it's paying big tax, that is not a problem. It's a real sign that you're doing something right. So I think a lot of farm business owners and small business owners like to think of themselves as a quasi-tax specialist, and they like to think of these strategies which help them stop saving, which save tax. In reality, it might not be the most profitable strategy for their farming business. So the example I was telling you about before with the haymaking equipment. So, righto, you think you've got a tax problem. You've told your accountant about your tax problem. Your accountant's gone, oh, do you need any gear, Jack? And Jack's sitting there thinking, oh, gee, some haymaking gear would be great. And then you feel good because you got your haymaking gear. The accountant feels good because your tax problem has gone away. But is that haymaking gear, $100,000 worth of haymaking gear, actually going to make your business more profitable in the long run? Or was buying fodder in going to be better? Or was getting a contractor to cut your hay better? Or was a farm management deposit better? It hasn't answered any of those questions. So I think whenever you feel like you're in the, I use this example, like if you read Harry Potter and they talk about like the muggles and they talk about the magical people. So like you're a muggle when it comes to tax planning. All farmers are muggles when it comes to tax planning. The accountants are the magicians, and we've got to leave that work up to them and just stay in our lane with running profitable farming businesses, and certainly having those open conversations with our accountants and finding a good one so they know what the profit drivers are in your business. They know what contributes to your cost production. They know what reduces risk in your business, and they've got a good handle on it as well.
That's a really good response. I like that. To get the most out of our budgets and work with everything, what are some tools in the toolbox that we can lean on for budgeting, forecasting, that you like to use, or is Excel sheets the way to go?
Oh, look, it's just a tricky one at the moment. So if you asked me this question probably 6 or 7 years ago, most farming businesses were using AgriMaster or Phoenix, and both AgriMaster and Phoenix had excellent agricultural focused budgeting and forecasting tools built into them, and they did a really good job, and they were integrated within essentially the accounting bookkeeping system. Lots of people now, and I'd say probably somewhere between 60 and 70% are using Xero, and Xero doesn't have a native inbuilt budgeting tool. And it has some level of budgeting, but it's really not suited to agricultural businesses because we've got a budget, like at a gross margin level. Look at debt going up and down, look at fodder stores going up and down, look at livestock going up and down. So there are a few different tools which integrate with Xero that can be used for those people using that program. So yes, there's Excel, there's P2P Agri, and I can give you a link in the show notes to a webinar where we actually went through all of these. Cash Peak, there's Figured, there's another one that escapes my knowledge, but it'll be in the show notes. And or we can use Excel. If we've got AgriMaster or Phoenix and we're not using the budgeting components of those tools, I'd suggest that would be the first place to start. Now, Excel's great, but if you're not proficient in Excel, and Excel's great for those longer term strategy budgets because you make everything look exactly the way you want it to do. What it's difficult to do in Excel is load your actuals for that quarterly or monthly review, especially if you've got a lot of line items, especially if you're wanting to track, quantities and things like that. So that's sometimes where some of these other purpose-built for agriculture integrated tools with Xero come in handy. But it's a problem that everyone's sort of having, I think.
Yeah, especially there was a lot of questions on that harvesting the crop, about what people are using for budgeting and forecasting. I think like people are wanting to know how to improve or maybe take the workload, the guessing game out of it a fair bit. So it's good to have a few tools in your toolkit for it.
Yeah, definitely. Most definitely.
So throughout your experience, what was the best piece of farms advice someone's passed on to you? Sydney gal moving out west? West.
A great aunt. An aunt-in-law, so my husband's aunt, said to me, never learn to drive the tractor. And that was some great advice. And she said, you just don't want to be too good at everything, Carmen. And I thought that was fantastic. So I've sort of really, my favourite paddock's The Office. and that's where I work my magic. And that has, I'm really bossy, Jack. So that's probably saved my marriage as well, because if I did a lot of the stuff out in the paddock, I probably wouldn't be married anymore. So yeah, that's probably the best advice I've had.
So Carmen, from this episode, what's one piece of farms advice you'd like the farm business owners, managers to take away and go to your favourite paddock, the office?
Look, I think my one goal would be to think bigger and to think optimistically. We're quite good a lot of the time about thinking about that downside risk of what happens if things turn dry, what happens if prices go low. But it's about saying to yourself, look, what could we achieve? What could we really achieve over the next decade if we had a really good go at this, and thinking a bit bigger. There's more to be, I think, gained by that optimistic mindset. Doesn't mean that you can't be you can't look at the risks your business is facing, but actually saying, okay, well, look, what you want to achieve could be a lot bigger than you think.
That's a good one. Go large, but probably within the boundaries of what you can do, and don't overexert yourself.
Well, it might not be large in terms of scale or scope or whatever else, but it's just having big thinking, big picture thinking. Yeah, definitely.
That's good. That's a great piece of farmers advice to finish on. The last thing is for the Farmers Book Club. Do you have any book recommendations? Any genre?
Yeah, I've got a few. But I think the first thing I'd say is there's a real danger in ag with it all becoming all about ag. Yep. So, we listen to ag podcasts, which are great. We farm. All of our friends are farmers. When we go to the swimming carnival, which I'm at the moment, we talk about farming, So sometimes there's a bit of space to actually read out of our farming genre. But if you are reading in the farming genre, I would recommend a couple of books. Crops, People, Money and You, and Kate Burke's been on your podcast. She wrote that one. It's a great book. There's also the Farming the Business Manual. It's put out by the GRDC, and Mike Krause wrote that one, and it's an excellent resource. And you were talking about ratios earlier. It's got all of the ratios. And it's GRDC, and it's got a real mixed farming bent to it. But all of the information that's in it, I think, would be applicable to any farming business, whatever the industry that you're in. Barefoot Investor, Scott Pape, is also a good read, I think, for anyone that's perhaps on the entry side of financial understanding and probably needs to get a handle on how things work from a money perspective. It's a really good one.
They're good ones. Do you have an outside ag one? Because you said not to go all ag.
No, I've been reading these trashy romance novels with my sisters while we've been on holidays, and I would hesitate to recommend Nora Roberts to anyone. All these, lots of all these tall, beg your pardon?
It's all Colleen Hoover these days, I see.
Oh, is it? I don't know. And it'd be the same thing with all of them. There's tall, dark and handsome male characters and lots of thrusting, Jack. So I won't be talking about this on this very PG podcast.
I don't know. It's a farming podcast. Is anything PG?
Probably not.
No, that's good, Carmen. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. I did wonder. I thought I'd seen that eyeline clock behind you before. So you're doing this at the swimming carnival?
At the swimming carnival. They've just wrapped up. So I've seen most of the kids' races and just missed the presentation. But there's only there's 8 kids at my children's school. 3 of them are mine. And then we've joined together with another little school, Leith Alley up the road. So pretty much every kid's got a ribbon because there's not many people in each age category once you divide them by gender and age, class. So they've all done very well today, Jack.
I had to swim with all the girls when I was in primary school because there was no males at school that would swim, or there was lacking of anyway. So I had to state finals, and I was crying at the blocks because I couldn't swim for shit. And I swam against all these guns when I was about 14 or something. I was like, this is... Yeah, this is the
discussion I've got to have with my children on the way home when they tell me that they've made it to district, and I have to say, look, you did the lap of freestyle without even putting your head underwater. I'm not going to be driving 200 kilometres for you to compete in the district swimming carnival, darling.
I have to set up a budget for it.
Yeah, too much. No
Carmen,
opportunity cost.
Thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with us, and more than welcome to come on again. I loved it.
Great, Jack. I really enjoyed the chat too.
Thank you so much for listening to the Farms Advice podcast. Thank you for Carmen for coming on, donating her expertise to you so you can improve your own farm office, farm business. We all want to be successful so we can have that holiday away. In the end, that is the end goal. And for you to support the podcast, just make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting platforms and make sure you keep it social at Farms Advice, wherever you find us, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. There's too many platforms anyway. But until next Tuesday, keep on farming.